them a foreboding that claws at the soul, an uneasiness that whispers in our ears that something terrible is about to happen. Marcus Thompson knew this feeling well. At 33, he carried in his veins a secret that terrified him more than any nightmare. It was one of those nights when the full moon approached and his body began to tingle with a sinister energy he couldn't control. The Quick Stop 24 convenience store was his refuge during the darkest hours. Located on Highway 61, between Springfield and Cedar Falls, it stayed open all night, offering an island of artificial light amidst the rural darkness. Marcus had become a regular customer, always buying bitter coffee and cigarettes he never smoked completely, just to have an excuse not to be home alone when the transformation approached. On that particular night, the air carried a strange electricity. The wind blew through the bare trees lining the road, creating a sound reminiscent of distant howls. Marcus drove his 1995 Chevrolet into the store's parking lot, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. His fingers seemed longer than usual, his nails slightly sharper. The reflection in the rearview mirror showed eyes that glowed with animalistic intensity, even in the dim dashboard light. Inside the store, Sarah Martinez, a 22-year-old student working the overnight shift to pay for college, was organizing the snack shelves. She'd noticed Marcus over the past few weeks, always arriving in the early hours of the morning, buying the same things and leaving quickly. There was something disturbing in his eyes, a deep pain she couldn't quite identify. His movements were tense, as if he were constantly fighting something internal. The doorbell rang as Marcus entered, bringing with it the smell of damp earth and something wild Sarah couldn't name. He walked straight to the drinks fridge, grabbed 2 cans of energy drinks, and headed to the counter. His hands trembled visibly as he handed over the money, and Sarah noticed fresh scratches on his wrists, as if he'd been struggling against invisible handcuffs. Their conversation was brief and tense. Marcus asked about the store's opening hours, if she worked alone during the early hours of the morning, if there was a safe place where she could lock the doors in case something happened. Sarah responded cautiously, feeling a growing anxiety at his strange questions. There was something desperate in his voice, as if he were trying to protect her from a danger she couldn't see. Outside, dark clouds began to dissipate, revealing the full moon in all its sinister glory. Its silvery light bathed the empty parking lot, creating long, distorted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Marcus felt the first wave of pain ripple down his spine, a terrifying warning that there was no more time to flee. The Quick Stop 24 establishment had a peculiar history in the region. Built on land that once stood as an abandoned farm, the place was the subject of rumors among locals. Some said wild animals were frequently sighted nearby, wolves descending from the mountains on nights with a full moon. Others whispered of mysterious disappearances that always occurred on the same dates of the month, when the moon reached its zenith. Marcus knew these stories better than anyone in town. His own nightmares began when he moved to the area almost 2 years ago. Initially, he thought they were just vivid dreams, reflections of the stress of starting a new life after his divorce. But the marks that appeared on his body in the morning, the mud trails on his clothes, and the feeling of having run for miles during the night made him realize something much more sinister was happening. The first complete transformation occurred during a winter storm. Marcus woke up naked in the snow, 3 miles from home, with blood under his fingernails and a ravenous hunger that terrified him. Fragments of animal memories hovered in his mind like fragmented nightmares, images of hunting, the smell of fear, and the sensation of muscles contracting with superhuman strength. From then on, each full moon became a desperate battle against his own nature. Marcus tried everything, tying himself up at home, locking himself in the basement, even considering voluntarily committing himself to a psychiatric hospital. But nothing worked. The creature inside him always found a way to break free, and with each awakening, the terror of discovering what he had done during the transformation consumed him a little more. The convenience store's proximity offered a strange sense of security. There were people nearby, artificial light that kept the shadows at bay, and a sense of normalcy that temporarily calmed the beast growing within him. Marcus didn't know that on that particular night, his presence in the store wouldn't be just another solitary vigil, but the beginning of a nightmare that would change both his and Sarah's lives forever. The clock on the store wall read 2:15 in the morning when Sarah realized something was definitely wrong. Marcus had been in the store for over an hour, wandering the aisles like a caged animal, picking up items from the shelves and putting them back. His movements became more erratic, and she could hear heavy, irregular breathing coming from his direction. The full moon hung in the sky like a watchful eye, its light streaming through the store's large windows and creating ghostly patterns on the floor. Sarah tried to keep busy, but she couldn't ignore Marcus's unsettling presence. He approached the counter several times, opening his mouth as if to say something important, but always gave up and returned to the shelves with an expression of growing despair. Marcus felt his skin tingle uncontrollably. It was as if thousands of microscopic needles were piercing every pore of his body. His gums began to throb, and he could feel his canines slowly elongating, pressing against his lower lip. His vision became sharper by the minute, picking up details that would normally go unnoticed. The rapid beating of Sarah's heart, the scent of fear beginning to emanate from her skin, the sound of her nervous movements behind the counter. The first muscle contraction hit him like a lightning bolt. Marcus doubled over between the aisles of canned goods, clutching his stomach as waves of pain coursed through his torso. His bones seemed to be rearranging themselves internally, growing and contracting at a rate that defied all medical logic. He tried to control his breathing, but guttural sounds escaped his throat, primal echoes of something no longer fully human. Sarah heard the moans and approached cautiously. She asked if he needed help, if she should call an ambulance. Marcus lifted his head to answer, and she saw for the first time the transformation taking place before her eyes. His eyes remained human, but they shone with an otherworldly intensity. His nose began to protrude forward, forming a rudimentary snout, while tufts of dark fur emerged along his cheeks. The genuine terror Sarah felt in that moment was like a catalyst for Marcus's transformation. The scent of her fear hit his nostrils like a powerful drug, awakening predatory instincts he had struggled to suppress. His muscles began to expand, tearing at the seams of his orange shirt. His hands widened, fingers lengthening as sharp claws pierced the skin at his fingertips. Sarah ran behind the counter and tried to grab the phone to call the police, but the line was dead. A storm was approaching outside, and the telephone wires had been knocked down by the wind. She looked out the window and realized there were no cars passing by on the road, no lights beyond the store for miles. She was completely isolated with a creature that seemed to have come from her worst nightmares. Marcus fought the transformation with every fiber of his remaining humanity. He clung to the shelves, trying to stay upright as his bone structure rearranged itself. Part of his mind still functioned rationally, screaming internally for him to get out of there before it was too late. But his feet felt rooted to the store floor, and Sarah's presence, her heart beating like a war drum, made any attempt at escape impossible. The security mirror in the corner of the store reflected an image that terrified him. His face was gradually deforming, retaining human features but taking on bestial aspects. His dark, slicked-back hair remained the same, but now framed features that were a disturbing hybrid between man and wolf, His human eyes brimmed with a mixture of pain and primal rage, while fangs emerged from his partially deformed muzzle-like mouth. Marcus's transformation reached its most intense stage when the shop clock struck 2:45 in the morning. His orange shirt hung in tatters from his impossibly expanding torso, muscles contracting and growing beneath skin that now showed irregular patches of dark hair. Sarah watched in horror from behind the counter, her mind trying to process the impossibility of what she was witnessing. The sounds emanating from Marcus's throat were no longer entirely human. They were a disturbing mix of pained groans and deep growls that reverberated through the silent store. He clutched at the shelves, knocking over products that rolled across the floor with metallic clangs that echoed like death knells. His hands gradually transformed, fingers lengthening as claws pierced his skin, leaving trails of blood on the surfaces he touched. Sarah noticed that the store doors had automatically locked. The nighttime security system had been activated for some unknown reason, perhaps due to the approaching storm. The lights flickered intermittently, creating an even more ominous atmosphere. She tried to force open the back door, but it was also locked. Panic began to set in as she realized she was trapped with a creature that seemed to be becoming less and less human. Marcus felt his human conscience fighting against animal instincts that were growing in intensity. Fragments of his normal personality still lingered, screaming internally at him to protect Sarah, to find a way out of here before he hurt her. But these thoughts were like whispers against a storm of primal fury raging in his transformed mind. His legs began to change, becoming more muscular and agile. His balance shifted as his feet widened, and he now moved with a predatory grace that contrasted sharply with the pain evident in his expression. Every movement was a struggle between the humanity trying to hold on and the beast demanding complete release. Sarah noticed that Marcus's eyes, though still human, now reflected the store's artificial light like those of a nocturnal animal. There was a disturbing intelligence in that gaze, not the blank consciousness of a beast, but something more terrifying, a creature that retained fragments of humanity even amidst its monstrous transformation. The smell in the store changed completely. The air now carried a savage odor, a mixture of sweat, blood, and something primal that made Sarah's survival instincts scream for her to run. But there was nowhere to go. The windows were reinforced, the doors locked, and outside the storm had arrived in full force, bringing winds that made the store's structure groan and creak. Marcus approached the counter, each step a struggle between control and surrender. His breathing was ragged, punctuated by guttural sounds that made Sarah instinctively recoil. When he raised one of his transformed hands, she could see fully formed claws, capable of tearing through flesh and bone with terrifying ease. Marcus's rational side still functioned at some deep level. He knew he needed to find a way to restrain himself, to protect the innocent woman who had become a prisoner of his personal nightmare. With superhuman effort, he managed to force a few words through his partially transformed throat, a desperate warning for her to hide, to find a way to survive until dawn. Sarah heard the distorted words and understood that, despite the horrific transformation, there was still a spark of humanity fighting within the creature. This realization was both a relief and an added terror, for it meant Marcus was aware of the horror he had become, trapped in a body he could no longer fully control. The convenience store transformed into a horror theater when Marcus completed his metamorphosis. His hybrid form was more terrifying than any purely animal creature could be. He retained his bipedal stance and recognizable human facial features, but distorted into a bestial caricature that challenged the sanity of any observer. Sarah cowered behind the counter, her hands trembling as she desperately searched for some makeshift weapon. The werewolf Marcus had become moved around the store with a disturbing combination of animalistic grace and human awareness. His eyes roamed every corner of the establishment, not with the randomness of a beast, but with the terrifying methodicality of a mind still processing information rationally. He seemed to be mapping out every possible escape route, every potential hiding place, as if part of his humanity were aiding his predatory instincts. Sarah watched in fascination and horror as the creature interacted with its surroundings. Marcus knocked items off the shelves, but not randomly. There was a systematicity to its movements, as if it were eliminating obstacles or creating barriers. Its claws left deep marks in the metal of the shelves, scratches that glistened under the store's intermittent fluorescent lighting. The storm outside reached its peak, and thunder reverberated through the shop's ceiling like the screams of ancient gods. With each flash of lightning, Marcus's shadow was projected onto the walls in grotesque, distorted shapes. Sarah noticed the creature reacting to the sounds of the storm, its head instinctively turning in the direction of each new thunderclap, as if recognizing familiar voices in the fury of the elements. Marcus fought internally against impulses that grew more intense by the minute. Part of his human mind still worked, screaming desperate commands at him to control himself, to not hurt Sarah. But these thoughts were like screams against a hurricane of primal instincts. His sense of smell captured every nuance of her fear, every drop of adrenaline coursing through her veins, and these scents awakened a hunger that went beyond the simple need for food. The creature slowly approached the counter behind which Sarah was hiding. Each step was calculated, as if Marcus still retained enough control to make its approach more terrifying. Its claws scraped against the linoleum floor, creating a sound that made Sarah's hair stand on end. When it finally emerged from the other side of the counter, she could see its complete transformation up close. Marcus's face retained its basic features, but was distorted in a way that defied any natural explanation. His human eyes, filled with pain and rage, contrasted starkly with his partially formed snout and the fangs emerging from his mouth. Tufts of dark fur covered parts of his skin, creating an irregular pattern that suggested an incomplete transformation, as if he were caught between two worlds. Sarah tried to speak, to beg for her life, but the words came out as incomprehensible whispers. The creature inclined its head, and for a moment she saw a flicker of human recognition in its eyes. Marcus was still there, trapped within that monstrous form, fighting instincts that threatened to consume him completely. The most terrifying part of the situation was not just the physical aspect of the transformation, but the evident awareness behind those eyes. Marcus knew exactly what was happening, could probably foresee every violent impulse before it manifested, but he was powerless to stop them. It was a prison of flesh and instinct that transformed his very existence into a personal hell. Sarah realized the creature was trying to communicate something. Its guttural sounds had a cadence that suggested language, fragments of human words mixed with primal growls. It was like listening to someone drowning in their own transformation, struggling to maintain the surface of humanity in an ocean of bestiality. The confrontation between Sarah and the creature Marcus had transformed into reached a critical juncture when she realized there was truly nowhere to run. The store had become an enclosed arena, and she was trapped with a predator that retained enough human intelligence to render any attempt at escape a terrifying futility. Her options were limited to temporary hiding places among the shelves and the desperate hope that dawn would break before the situation became even more deadly. Marcus, in his werewolf form, seemed to be waging an epic battle with himself. His movements were interspersed with moments of hesitation, as if two consciousnesses were fighting for control of the same body. At times, he approached Sarah with clearly predatory intent, claws extended and muscles tensed for attack. At others, he stopped abruptly and retreated, growling in frustration against his own instincts. Sarah began to understand that her survival depended on nurturing the human part of Marcus that still lingered. She spoke to him quietly, reminding him of who he was before the transformation. She mentioned details she had observed during her visits to the store, how he always bought the same products, how his hands shook when handing over the money, how his eyes held a deep sadness that now made terrible sense. The creature reacted to these words in a disturbing way. Its growls lessened in intensity, and she could see genuine conflict in its distorted expression. It was like watching a civil war unfold in real time, with humanity and bestiality alternating in control of that hybrid body. Each temporary victory of human consciousness offered Sarah a few precious moments of relative safety. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, but clouds still covered the full moon. Sarah noticed that the intensity of Marcus's transformation seemed directly related to the visibility of the night sky. When occasional lightning flashes illuminated the sky and the moon was momentarily visible, the creature became more agitated and aggressive. During periods of total darkness, fragments of humanity seemed to resurface. Marcus tried to communicate his anguish through sounds that were half human, half animal. Sarah began to decipher patterns in this distorted language. He seemed to be trying to warn her about something, perhaps about what would happen when the storm passed completely and the moon was fully exposed. His attempts at communication were punctuated by spasms of pain, as if the very act of maintaining human consciousness were physically agonizing. The store had become a museum of controlled destruction. Products strewn across the floor, shelves damaged, claw marks on the walls and ceiling. But Sarah noticed the destruction had a pattern. Marcus wasn't simply destroying for the sake of destroying, he was eliminating potential weapons or creating barriers to prevent a hasty escape. It was strategy, not vandalism. The human mind still worked, even if in the service of predatory instincts. The tension reached a new level as Sarah noticed the clouds were beginning to dissipate more quickly. Moonbeams began to penetrate the shop windows with greater intensity, and each beam of silvery light seemed to add layers of aggression to the creature. Marcus began to move more erratically, his eyes glowing with an intensity that suggested human control was rapidly slipping away. In a moment of desperate lucidity, Marcus managed to articulate a clear word through his transformed throat. It was a warning, a final cry of his humanity trying to protect Sarah from what was about to happen. He pointed to the storage room at the back of the store, a small room with a reinforced door where she could lock herself. It was his last attempt to keep her safe before the beast took complete control. Sarah ran to the warehouse, but not before looking back and seeing the expression of gratitude and terror in Marcus's still human eyes. It was the look of someone who knew he was losing a crucial battle against his own nature, and who was using his last moments of consciousness to try to save an innocent life. Sarah locked herself in the small storage room at the back of the store, just as the clouds dispersed completely, allowing the full moon to bathe the interior of Quickstop 24 in its eerie silver light. On the other side of the door, she could hear sounds that were no longer remotely human. Marcus had completely lost the battle against his bestial nature, and the noises emanating from the main store were a symphony of primal destruction. The warehouse was small and claustrophobic, filled with boxes of cleaning products and equipment. Sarah huddled in a corner, trying to control her breathing as she listened to the chaos on the other side of the door. Shelves were knocked over, glass shattered, and above it all, a blood-curdling howl echoed through the entire structure of the building. It was a sound that seemed to come from primitive times, when humanity still fought for survival against predators that inhabited the darkness. The next few hours became an eternity of psychological terror. Sarah could feel the creature's presence on the other side of the door, occasionally scratching the wood with claws that left deep grooves. But the door held, and she clung to the hope that Marcus had chosen this particular hiding place because he knew its resilience. Even in its bestial form, fragments of its humanity seemed to be trying to protect it. The sounds from the main store gradually changed throughout the night. Periods of frenetic activity were interspersed with absolute silences that were even more terrifying. During these moments of stillness, Sarah wondered if the creature had left, or if it was simply waiting, planning, using its residual human intelligence to refine the terror even further. Occasionally, she heard attempts at communication through the door. They were no longer recognizable words, but there was a cadence to the vocalizations that suggested Marcus still retained some level of consciousness. They were like distant echoes of his humanity, trying to penetrate the barrier of his bestial transformation. Sarah responded by whispering his name, trying to keep alive any spark of rationality that might still exist. Dawn was slowly approaching, and Sarah noticed subtle changes in the sounds outside. The creature's activity became less intense, interspersed with longer periods of silence. It was as if the proximity of sunlight was gradually weakening the power of the transformation. But she didn't know if this meant Marcus would return to normal, or if the change would be permanent. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through a small window in the warehouse, Sarah heard something that made her freeze in terror. They were human footsteps, slow and hesitant, walking among the wreckage of the store. It was no longer the creature's heavy, agile stride, but the staggering gait of someone trying to regain balance and orientation. A familiar voice, yet profoundly altered by the previous night's experience, called her name through the door. It was Marcus, seemingly back in human form, but carrying a weight of horror and guilt that seemed overwhelming. He begged her not to leave, to wait until he was sure the transformation had completely worn off. Sarah heard Marcus gather up the remains of his torn orange shirt, trying to cover his naked, wounded body. His voice trembled as he described fragments of memories from the night before, bits of bestial consciousness that terrified him more than any nightmare. He remembered his struggle not to hurt her, the agony of holding on to fragments of humanity while primal instincts tried to take over. When Sarah finally emerged from the warehouse, she found Marcus sitting among the rubble of the store, still partially wearing the remains of his clothes from the previous night. His human eyes now carried an added weight of trauma, the terrible certainty that this night would not be their last. The full moon would return, and with it, the transformation that had nearly destroyed them. They stared at each other in silence, two survivors of a nightmare that defied any rational explanation. Sarah saw in Marcus's eyes not only the relief at having survived another night, but also the terror of the next full moon that would inevitably arrive. And as the sun rose over the destroyed store, they both knew they had shared something that would change their lives forever, but which they could never explain to anyone else. The story remains open-ended, as some secrets are too big to be resolved simply. Marcus continues his existence marked by the lunar curse, and Sarah forever carries the memory of that night that challenged everything she believed about reality. The cycle continues, relentless as the moon itself.